As promised, a few essay plans from paper 3. I've tried to select different topics to make them more interesting, and I've hopefully selected questions that present different challenges in the way we respond to them. So we'll see what I come up with. Now then, as with paper 2, I've gone to my collection of past exam questions, selected out 3, copied and pasted onto this Word doc, and however long that takes me, I suppose that's given me a little bit of extra thinking time, but nothing more than that. And look, in any case, the purpose of this exercise is not for me to show off. I might embarrass myself. The purpose is to show that you do have time to write an essay plan. That's the purpose of this. So let's have a look at this first question. The First World War was the main cause of the 1917 Feb-March revolution in Russia. To what extent do you agree with this statement? Okay. Now, I always like to look for marks in my introductions. So for this essay, I'm going to go for context. And I'm going to select out 1905 as the year in which Tsarism wobbled, and just note that happened in my introduction, but bring in the war and note that war was supported. It's not going to be a long intro. And that now already gives me two sides to this discussion. I've mentioned the war, but I've mentioned factors before the war. Okay, so context. Now, for this kind of essay with a statement and then a to what extent or how far, I would tend to begin with agreeing with the statement. So what are my arguments that World War I was the main cause? Right, I would go for weak war leadership. Weak war leadership. From the Tsar downwards, and I could write about the defeats that the army faced right from the beginning and right up to the end. I could write about the horrendous casualties that the army suffered and the poor supplies to the army, both food and munitions. I think I've got enough to write about there in a paragraph. My next paragraph, I would go for the crises at home. Crises at home. And there I again write about the terrible food supplies to the cities, the wartime inflation, and I could write about the peasants who had no incentive to supply food to the cities. What would they do with any money that they got from that? Nothing was being made except for guns and bombs and things. So I think I would have enough to write about there in a good paragraph. But what about other factors? Now I would write about this if only because I love the word. I would write a paragraph on Tsarism as an anachronism, out of time, past its sell-by date. And I could write about the limited participation in the government of Russia, not just a lack of participation from the peasantry and from the workers in the cities, but the middle classes and even a fair number of the aristocracy felt somewhat disenfranchised. So I could write about that. I could write about the lack of civil rights in Russia. And having put it in my context, I could write about 1905 having given reforms, given a Duma and something of a constitution. It was no sooner given than it was taken away by the Tsar. So again, I think I've got plenty to write about in a paragraph there, and then linked to that, I would write about Russian backwardness. You can see that there's nothing startlingly unexpected in this, but what I'm presenting is a coherent essay. And I'm able to do that because I think before I write. So let's see, Russian backwardness. Well, serfdom might have been abolished, but agriculture still looks pretty medieval in the way it's organized. Russia is late to industrialize. And so there are few consumer goods. I could write a good paragraph there, I'm absolutely sure. And then I can bring it together in my conclusion. And this is certainly where I see things. I would say these fundamental factors, the anachronism, the backwardness, were, the most significant, but war was the trigger. And there you see, I think, a coherent plan. I'm happy with that. I hope you are. So let's have a look at the next one. Yes. I know why I picked this, because sometimes a question has an essay plan sitting there in it. Look at this question. Compare and contrast the social and economic policies of Hitler and Mussolini. Well, we have our topic sitting there, or topics, Hitler and Mussolini. And we're told what to do. Compare and contrast what? The social and economic policies of Hitler and Mussolini. So, I would have a paragraph comparing, a paragraph contrasting the social policies, and a paragraph comparing and contrasting the economic policies. So that is pretty straightforward, I think. But what about an intro that will earn marks? I'm going to go for, and then it sets me up, I think, for my essay. I will go for principles of fascism linked to social and economic policies. And they would include control of the economy for the good of all, was the intent. I would go for, on the social side, that fascism was this thing that was going to end class and bring everyone together, everyone working for the state, for the good of the state, and therefore for the good of all. They're the principles of fascism, the main ones that I think will link to this question. So, myself, I would go for always, I would go for economic policies first. I'm a bit of a Marxist here in that I understand Marx's analysis or the way in which Marx analyzes societies. He argues that everything comes from the economy, the social conditions, the social relationships, they're all based on the way the economy is organized. And the same with politics. Not this question, but Marx argues it's the same with politics. And I think that's a great tool um, for planning essays. So I would always begin with the economic. I do in all my writing. That's where I always begin in looking at societies. So economic policies, where do they? Um, I think I would go for contrasts first. It's my essay. I can do it in whatever order I want. I would go for economic contrasts first. Now, let me be perfectly honest here. I think I would be okay going into detail on Hitler's policies, but it's a while since I've read up on Mussolini. So I would struggle. I'm gonna sidetrack a little bit here. Bear with me. I once went to an A-level teachers conference in the UK, and as part of the conference, the chief examiner gave us all a talk. And at one point, he said, "My advice would be tell your students to answer the questions they know the least about." And as soon as he said it, I knew what he meant. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. Because what he was getting at was that when you know a topic so well, you're tempted to chuck everything down to show the examiner that you know it so well. And you can lose focus. And you can certainly uh, weight your essay far too much on giving knowledge and not enough on explaining and showing just how well you understand the topic as well. So here's a question that actually I would struggle a little bit right now. I would do my revision and I would be a lot better come the real thing. But right now I would be pretty weak on Mussolini. So how do I hide that? Now then, economic contrasts. The Great Depression. Mussolini comes to power before the Great Depression. Hitler comes to power after the Great Depression. That has to make a difference to their policies. What was Hitler's great initiative? Get people back to work. So I would go for that as a contrast. And the other, I think, interesting contrast here is that Mussolini leads a less than modern state, shall we say. Southern Italy was quite backward, and it wasn't as industrialized. And any part of Italy wasn't as industrialized as other parts of Europe. Whereas Hitler, even with the Treaty of Versailles impacting on Germany, he takes over a modern economy. And even with the Great Depression impacting as well, he does take over a very modern, advanced economy. And I think they are important contrasts. So I put economic development there. So, economic comparisons. Well, I've talked about the principles of fascism in my introduction. They are both fascist. And that means they will both keep capitalism, but they will look to control it from the center and direct it down the pathways that they want it to go. But capitalism will stay. They will favor the owners of factories and mines and what have you. They will look to control the workers. They will take away free trade unions, for example. And both regimes will prepare their economies for war. So I could write about that too. So I think I've got 2 good paragraphs there. Now then, if we move on to the social, I would stay with comparisons. Social comparisons. I would stay with comparisons because I would keep with the fascism thing. They both look to create fascists. And this gives me a chance now to put all into one paragraph their education, or the thrust behind their education policies, the youth movements that they seek to develop. And I think also the separate roles for men and for women, the separate spheres, as Hitler described it. That would make for a good paragraph. And then I have to deal with contrasts, and there can only be one, or there must be race included, I think, in our contrasts. And so I would focus on race, that it was much more important in Nazi Germany than it was in Mussolini's Italy. Compare and contrast. How do I conclude? It's not a to what extent or how far question, but if I'm comparing and contrasting, I think I have to conclude, well, how far? And I think I would conclude, and there is nothing wrong with this, I would say it was decidedly mixed. And I think my essay shows that. And this is where you see the value, I think, already of planning. I have coherent essays. They flow. They flow. The intro matches the body of the essay. The conclusion is supported by the essay. The other advantage is, if we jump back up to here, as I'm writing about the crises at home during the war in Russia, I don't have to worry about anachronism and backwardness. I know they're going to be the next paragraphs. I'll deal with it when I'm there. I don't have to worry about what am I going to write next. Yeah, I know what I'm going to write next. I have my plan. So let's have a look at the last one. Oh yeah, and I would say as well, if you've looked at the paper 2 video, you'll see that I used 24 words as a target. It is a target. I'm not going to go back and count them, but I'll bet you they're under 24 words or not far off. The reason for this is 24 words is doable. I've done a lot of talking in this. It wouldn't take me long to write those plans out. It's the thinking that takes the time. But I don't want to write all the detail that I've been talking about. That will come when I get to that paragraph. What I want is a plan, coherence, a flow, and I get that. I get that with 24 words. I think I said in the paper 2 video that I did that, think of the plan as the chapter titles, chapter headings in a book. That's how I look at it. This is what this paragraph is going to be about. Okay, let's have a look at the last question. And it's similar to the previous one in that we have a plan in the essay, in the question. But I've chosen this one for 2 other reasons. One is it gives us dates. And this date in particular is really important because the question is in what ways and with what results for Europe between 1939 and 1949 was the Second World War a total war? But I have to look beyond the war up to 1949. Not to include any specific events, but I have to include the post-war period or the immediate post-war period. So that's important, I think. And the other one is this. This is a gimme for my introduction. I have an introduction that will earn me marks. Ugh, even if I can't type. I will define total war. What would I write about? Government control of the economies, government control of people, the importance of the home front, the need for conscription, the targeting of civilians. And I'm sure they will all come up in my essay as well. There might be more to defining total war, but that gets my essay focused and gets me marks, I'm sure. Now then, the ways. Right. Well, I've already talked about a number of ways in which World War I was total in my introduction. I would go for control. I always start with the economy. I would go for control of the economy, control of economy. It's my plan. It doesn't have to be precise English. And the control of the economy, oh goodness, I could write about the identification of key workers who would not be conscripted, the likes of miners, shipbuilders, that kind of worker. I could look at the control of conditions in the workplace, the control of pay and prices. I think I've got enough there for a paragraph there. I'm not going to write long paragraphs here because I want to cover a number of ways. So I think in order to get in the different ways, I've got to shorten those paragraphs. And so I will. I'm confident that will work. And so control of people that I put in my introduction. And I would write about women going into the workplace, the evacuation of kids into the countryside away from potential bombing, and the need to accommodate those children. And so people had to give their spare bedroom to these sweeties. What else could I write about? Well, control of people. I put it in my intro. Um, I think the significance of conscription. You know, that's a tremendous power that the government has. It's telling people you will go to war where you could well die. That is tremendous control of people, conscription. And I would write, because I know I can cover it, and remember there's no such thing as a perfect essay plan. There's no such thing as one essay plan, but I would go for targeting civilians. I would write about the bombing of civilians. I could write about merchant ships being sunk by submarines, particularly. They are civilians, civilian sailors on those ships. And I could write about the targeting of civilians on the Eastern Front, particularly Jews. And so I could write a decent paragraph on that. Remember, I've got to be quick on these paragraphs because I've got more to cover. And the more to cover is results. Right. I will stay with civilians and their plight. They have been targeted. I would write about the hardships of rationing, hardships for women. They're in the workplace, but they might well also be young mothers with young children. They haven't all been shipped off to the countryside. They have the worry of their children if they have been evacuated. They have the worry about their husbands. The burden on women is considerable. I could write about the Blitz in London and elsewhere in Britain. I could write about the tremendous bombing of German cities, the women of the rubble, as they were called, because German cities were bombed into rubble as homes were destroyed. And I could write about the siege of Leningrad and Stalingrad and the horrendous conditions that civilians had to survive under. So plenty to write about there. I'm just tidying up. I'm going to give that a capital. And I've got to deal with that 1949 issue. So, post-war chaos. I will write about post-war chaos. That destruction in Germany. Germany was bombed to smithereens. It was almost utterly destroyed. Horrendous damage. I could talk about the fact that Germany was divided as the Russians occupied the eastern side of Germany and the Western Allies the western side. I could talk. I would then I would write in my plan lengthy rebuild, because I would write about the need to get soldiers back to work, the need to provide welfare support. These things are going to be longer term. And so I think I'm dealing with that 1949 part of the question. And then to conclude, well, again, I would go, it's not a how far, but I would go there. It was indeed total war. And so I think I have three good plans. Plans that are coherent, plans that have a logic to them, and honestly, rather, um, uh, take away all my anecdotes and giving you the detail of what I would write about in those paragraphs. I could write those three plans within 5 minutes each, comfortably. I suppose a final thought for you. I've talked now in two videos about my collection of past questions. I have all the past questions from the year 2000, broken down under the different topic areas. If you want them, I'm happy to send you a copy of them. Just drop me an email at historymadeeasier@gmail.com and I'll pass them on to you. Happy to do that for you. But for now, thanks for putting up with me. Thanks for listening. The key thing to remember is that there is no such thing as one good essay plan, but essay plans are good. Check out my website, History Made Easier, for more advice on skills.